He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Hey folks, it's Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia. Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is going to talk about something most of us in the metabolic health space are very interested in, sugar. And I particularly am interested to find out what his thoughts or his findings in regard to mental health. But Phil, I'm just the talking hairdo, so to speak. It's your job, so take it away.
Sounds good. Very excited to have Mike on. Mike is known as the sugar-free man on social media and does a lot of work around sugar addiction, and very interested in hearing his perspective. And obviously, this is a big issue in the world of metabolic health. So I think there's lots of exciting stuff to talk around that. Mike, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, give a little background, maybe talk about how you became the sugar-free man.
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate you guys having me. So, I have the short version, the podcast version. It actually goes back another generation. My mother was my favorite sugar junkie, and her mother, my grandmother, died when she was just 8 years old, and they owned the country store across the street. And my grandfather made a deal with his cousin Jim that anytime my mom walked into that store, she could have any kind of sugar she wanted, any kind of candy she wanted, just put it on his tab, which was a wonderful thing to do for an 8-year-old who lost her mom. But at the end of the day, she grew up, as we grew up, believing that sugar was love. And that's how she treated us as, kids, right? So I grew up with unfettered access to the sugar bowl for Cheerios and cornflakes and iced tea and Kool-Aid with 3 times the recipe. It was crazy, really. And fast forward, that was my childhood basically. And I ran into beer at 13 or 14. And really, this is kind of the crux of the entire message that I think is missing from pretty much every diet or way of eating, metabolic health, any kind of behavioral change, is that I knew beer changed my state. I was kind of shy, and I could, drink behind the high school and liquid courage, be able to talk to the girls. But what I didn't realize, and what I don't think people realize, is that I had been changing my state since I was a kid, since I was very young, with the sugar. My father was alcoholic, and it was kind of abusive and physically and verbally. And, every time something like that happened, my mother was our using buddy, and we would, hunker down with the cookies and the ice cream and whatever and soothe ourselves. And a lot of that is what's going on in my work. That's exactly what happened. So anyway, fast forward to 28, I get sober, and we can talk about all that. But the most important connection is that the biochemical addiction, the mental health, the transformation process of a lot of people trying to get off of sugar is locked in this knowing that biochemically a lot of people cannot use sugar without setting up cravings for more sugar. And so anyway, I ended up marrying a woman, and we had a couple kids, and I raised 2 kids sugar-free from the womb until they were 6 years old. And that was an amazing process. And the experiment worked mentally. I mean, the guys are like rocket scientists smart, 1600 on their SAT smart. And I'm not that smart. I just think their brain developed better, right? And then, they always said I should write a book. So I wrote a book in 2018, and I had opened Sugar Addiction and sugaraddiction.com in 2009 or something, but I was still working. And then I was kind of semi-retired around, when the book came out, and I was coaching people. And then the pandemic hit and all hell broke loose. Literally, before that, we had 2 support meetings a week, and it jumped to 4 or 5 a day because people were just at home and they were realizing what they were doing. You've seen the pictures on the news, in the news where all the sugar's gone, all the flour's gone, all the cookies are gone, all the alcohol, all the soda's all gone. And it's never slowed down since. And we just keep growing. We just recently got approved by the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaches, and we coach folks. And yeah, it's been a little bit around somewhere in the middle of all that. I think right around the pandemic, somebody kept calling me the sugar-free man, and that kind of stuck. So that's kind of how I ended up here. The short version. I can answer. It usually brings up more questions than it answers.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'd like to dig into there is, it sounds like you may have had a couple of different addictive issues in your life, and maybe you can, contrast a little bit, compare and contrast, the sugar addiction versus some of these other addictions, what they were like kind of experiencing them and then trying to overcome them.
Yeah, no, good question. And I can give you a lot of data on that because I guess maybe because I'm open about mine. About 10 years ago, I joined a group called, it's not really, there are formal groups, but Recovering Out Loud, in the belief that, anonymity in alcohol and drug recovery is dead, and that, Recovering Out Loud is a public service and, to get addiction named as a health issue, not a moral issue. Anyway, to answer your question, again, because I'm so open, I think that I've attracted, probably 500 or more, maybe approaching 1,000 now, of recovering alcoholics and drug addicts. And to a man, to a woman, every one of them has said quitting sugar has been harder. And that's the experience that I had, right? It's just the same. It's, the Rodney Dangerfield quote, I get no respect. Sugar gets no respect as an addictive substance. And that's not hair. I'm not doing heroin. I'm not drinking. I'm like, I know, I get it, but they just don't, the biochemistry they don't think is the same because it's not as buzzy or what. I don't know why, but it's real, and I've had thousands and thousands of people come through the program and realize that it is very real because, I could tell them to quit eating steak or broccoli for a month and they could do it, but they just can't seem to put down the sugar. So I think it's harder. I think it's genuinely the gateway drug. And I think it starts in childhood. And the main message is that people are self-soothing with sugar as opposed to, call it the difference between effort-based dopamine and substance-based dopamine, right? And when I use dopamine, I mean dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, oxytocin, adrenals, all of the brain and body reward chemicals are affected by sugar. And, people that we've learned to hack it by just sitting on the couch eating Oreos. And they're just not putting this kind of two and two together with the emotional salve, the emotional self-soothing.
That's the first time I've kind of heard that terminology. I'd like you to dig into it a little bit more. Effort-based dopamine versus reward-based dopamine.
Yeah, no, it's effort-based versus substance-based. So drugs, alcohol, whatever, I mean, they do have process addictions, obviously, sex, gambling, what have you. But at the end of the day, 10 million years of evolution, definitely 100,000 years of recent history, sex, food is all anchored in dopamine, in memories, in reward systems, and the whole thing. And it was evolved, this system, to survive, for survival. And here we are able to hack that system. And what happens is, when these children use sugar as opposed to going out for a walk or whatever, they never learn to self-soothe, right? And so you get to be an adult, instead of getting a manicure, a pedicure, a massage, go to yoga, go running, walking, whatever, this process, I call it living in process, the process of self-soothing, right? It doesn't really exist if you have sugar because it's powerful enough to soothe you. So the boss is a pain, the husband or the wife is being being rough, whatever. You just have a little sugar and put it off for a day or two. You don't think about it. But the problem, like with any drug, 20 minutes later you got to re-ingest. So this shift over from whatever type of self-soothing you would normally have, get a hug, watch a sunset, make food. There's a million ways. Just Google it. Google self-care. And we've learned to use sugar. And it's not a conscious thing. It's not like like you had a beer you need a beer on a Friday because you had a rough week, right? It's just, someone is bothering you, your boss, your client, and you head to the convenience store or the vending machine. It's not something, this is my job to break apart that understanding of why you're actually using it. It has nothing to do with a sweet taste on your tongue, zero. It has to do, and if people can remember that when they have sugar cravings, they're actually seeking a dopamine hit. And again, all of those brain reward chemicals, they're seeking dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, that's what they're looking for. And when they can make that cognitive, conscious decision, understanding, and raise it from the unconscious and the limbic brain, then it becomes real for them, right? That's an important distinction. So it was a good question.
Can you maybe drill a little deeper into what that looks like? And specifically, if, just story. Got
Yeah.
a story about this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it just happened recently. So I have a doctor in my certification program. She's a obstetrician or no, excuse me, a OBGYN. And she is, she's having a difficulty, she's having a little thing. Actually, I'm not talking out of school because we did this live on YouTube. She's got a new channel and she's been working on it. And she's been binging at least recently. And she's overweight and she knows, she's also a recovering alcoholic, 10 years sober or something like that. But she's a brilliant lady. And she was Miss America or Miss San Diego like a bunch of years ago. She's, pretty and brilliant. And she just can't seem to do this, right? Here we are live, we're doing this, and she could not understand why she was binging. And it took a long time, that session, for her to finally suss out this idea that she had visited her mom that morning at a care unit, at an Alzheimer's care unit, okay? And she didn't put the two and two together, that her mother had always criticized her no matter what she did, no matter what MD or whatever degree she got or whatever, pageant she won, she was never good enough, right? And here she is, still criticizing her, in the process of losing parts of her mind with Alzheimer's. And the two were not connected, okay? Now, she had been 3 weeks with no sugar, no flour, okay? But the two were not connected. And it took us 40 minutes to figure out why she was emotionally upset that day. You know what I mean? Why she would need, or why that day for the binge, And that happens all the time. That's just a common, it takes me a while to delve down and to try and figure out, what they're soothing.
Is this kind of the same kind of thing that alcoholics or drug addicts that leads them down that road? They get triggered emotionally and their self-soothing
It's exactly
is the chemical.
It's exactly the same.
I mean, it's in some ways it's almost too obvious. In some ways, it's almost unbelievable because it's so common. Are we a nation of sugar addicts? And I
No,
don't ask that.
we're a planet of sugar addicts. Yes, you're right. 100%. We've outsourced our entire crappy food system all over the world now. Look, you're on the right track, and a lot of this flows from Bethel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score" kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It's really, but it's real. Again, it gets no respect as a drug that can soothe you. The emotional eating folks have most of the process or most of the equation correct. The part they're missing is the biochemical addiction and the brain repair stuff, right? The brain,
Okay, talk about that.
yeah.
Let's follow that little rabbit down that particular path.
Their problem and the problem with the eating disorder folks is that you're not well if you can't moderate sugar. There should be some ability to moderate. But during the pandemic, I was the chairman of the board of the Food Addiction Institute, and that group of people has been doing this for 20 years, okay? And about a third of people, when they ingest sugar, they just set up cravings for more sugar, and it just never ends. They can't stop it. So they have to have the abstinence. They have to have an abstinent process. We have to get them detoxed. And then when they detox, or usually during when they're detoxing, they start with the common refrain is, Mike, I'm losing my mind. Because they've never, literally never gone 2 or 3 days since they were children without this ability to soothe with a psychoactive drug. And a lot, yeah, a lot of people get on me for, that's too much. It's only sugar is the common, they're telling me it's only sugar. But, 41,000 plus detoxes, I can tell you almost what day this is going to happen, depending if I did a good intake, from my one-on-one clients, depending, how they started, where they started, how heavy they were when they were younger. Our folks that were heavier at 3 and 4 and 5 years old are the most difficult clients because and it's not weight. Let me clarify that. This is not about weight. Weight is just a byproduct of this recovery, this change process, right? But because they obviously were abusing it early, they're self-soothing. They don't have muscle memory of, being able to self-soothe with their athletics or, whatever. And it all really, I mean, in my world, we're not trauma experts and we're not docs, but, we're very trauma informed. And a lot of this is covering up older trauma. And it doesn't have to be capital T, sexual, physical. It can be anything you never dealt with and you just needed to soothe a little bit.
And, one of the things that I think is, I guess, interesting and probably, leads to the bigger challenge around overcoming this is that, for the most part, other addictions don't start in infancy.
Correct.
And yet sugar, is introduced to almost everyone, almost from birth, but certainly at a young age, before you're really making a conscious decision about it, as opposed to something like, alcohol, let's say, or smoking, some people start relatively young, but it's still at an age where they're making that sort of conscious decision, whereas sugar becomes an unconscious thing. And, I mean, the average child doesn't realize they're soothing with sugar and doesn't realize the effects it's having in their brain, but it's happening and it's setting up that kind of subconscious pattern. So maybe talk a little bit about that and how you start to kind of unwind that, undo that.
Yeah, no, good question. So look, you're right, 100%. It is an unconscious thing. And it's not, again, like that beer on a Friday where you had a rough week. It's just, I need a soda. I feel like a soda. I feel like a candy bar, whatever. It's like this unconscious. But my job is to break that connection, to make it conscious that they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. In the medical profession, in my therapists that come to me and the docs and the people that are, that are getting certified with us through for their practice and want to add this kind of work to their practice, I call it the compliance issue. So they have like your practice or any practice, like they say, well, here's the first step. Quit the flour, quit the sugar. And about 2/3 of the people can do it. But it's the other third that basically end up at my doorstep because they've tried everything, from bariatric to GLP-1s and everything in between and 12 steps. And they've tried everything, but they can't seem to do it because no one has ever explained it this way. They never told them that they have been self-soothing with this process. You know what I mean? That they have done it since childhood. So I have to raise it up from the unconscious and get them to understand it. Again, the emotional eating folks and the eating disorder folks in the treatment centers and stuff, they got about 70% of the equation right. A lot of the work that they do is correct, but they don't look at the biochemical repair part. They don't look at the unconscious part. So yeah, it takes time to weed through it. And it can be pretty nasty, to be honest with you. Some people, I guess I forget the number. I think it's 50% of people in treatment for binge eating women have had some type of sexual abuse. And so sometimes some, stuff starts to come up and they start to process it. one of the things I'm studying and trying to figure out is that, do you have to process this stuff out one to one? So all the anger, fear, hurt, worry, and stuff, do you have to process that out? I love the phrase, the issues is in the are in the tissues, you know? Yeah, I like that phrase. And so I don't know the answer to that, and I wish I did, but there is a reckoning of sorts, and the body's not going to give you more than you can handle, and you have to lay into place, again, a yoga practice, a meditation practice, a walking practice, a running practice, some other way of self-soothing as you move through this work. And the really work does not start until after you're abstinent, after your detox. Now it'll start in it, during it, maybe, if you're unlucky or, have a bad habit. But for the most part, the change process happens after we get you detoxed.
And
You
when
said
you're
you've talked a couple of times about the healing, the neural or the brain healing.
Yeah.
Um, could you go down that path just a little bit more? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean,
And maybe you're just talking about the emotional health, but I got the impression you're talking also about something physiological.
no, I am. You're exactly right. They are together. The one summit we did was a brain and emotion summit. They're kind of tied together in a loose way, in that, the technical thing is, if you're a sugar addict and you've abused sugar, is that your dopamine receptors are downregulated. They're thinned out. You have less of them, right? And that goes across all of the, like, you're, as a child, or, as a young person or as a sugar addict, you are developing a neural pathway that is grew very deeply for this process, and there's not a lot of science that they regenerate, but there are a lot of science that you grow new ones and you can grow a new neural pathway, you know what I mean?
Right.
Which is a self-soothing. And pretty soon, after a while, you'll have a little flash that you want some ice cream, and you'll find yourself out walking the dog. You'll have flipped it, you know what I mean? You'll have flipped it. And so there's definitely a requirement for biochemical repair, that you have to repair if you look at what's his name, Dr. Amen's stuff, the people that abuse sugar have holes in their brain. And then a year later, if they get on the right diet, that goes away. They start to fill in. And they've done it, they're weaponizing it with the food companies. They'll slide you in an MRI and put their new thing, and they'll watch where it lights up in the brain. So
Right.
it's definitely biochemical and physical as well as emotional. You're right. It's a good catch.
And when you're talking about, abstinence, right? What does that mean? Because we have the obvious sugar, right? You have the table sugar and you put it in your coffee. We have things that, obviously contain sugar, right? Ice cream and
Right.
candy and cake. But then we have, carbohydrates that turn into sugar in our body. We have fruits, right, that contain these natural sugar. In your experience, what does it take to really be abstinent of sugar?
It's a great question. And the first question everybody asks, Mike, do I have to do this for the rest of my life? You have to be abstinent, what I call powder addiction, flour, sugar. And in our program, it's caffeine too. I'll tell you my story of the Olympic athlete and the caffeine is because caffeine is just going to keep the cravings alive. It was always
Keep
linked.
the sugar cravings alive?
Correct.
Okay.
The chocolate, the tea, the coffee is always linked together. The body's going to get one, it's going to say, where's the other? And so the powder addiction has to go first. Now, I get a lot of pushback and a lot of blowback on the fruit and the fructose. My favorite line, or my line, is, if you want to quit sugar, study fructose. And it's pronounced fructose too. If you want to quit sugar, study fructose, because the molecule is the same. The molecule in the fruit is the same as the molecule in the table sugar. It's the same molecule, right? There's no difference. And so what we do is, people are pounding orange juice and dates and everything, dried fruit. You can't do this in my program, at least at all, I don't believe, but when you're using dried fruit and fruit juice. Now, you can use a little bit of berries, kind of like your Suboxone or your methadone, to ease you through this. And then it goes on to the starchy vegetables and even the nuts, like Nuts are been hybridized to raise the fructose. Most of them aren't even nuts. They're drupes, D-R-U-P-E-S, drupes. And they're the seeds of fruits, which also have been hybridized to raise the fructose, to take the bitterness out, the sweetness, right? And so cashews and pecans, those things are drupes. And people begin very quickly after they heal from the powder addiction, the sugar addiction, the caffeine addiction. They start to eat full bags of cashews and full bags of pistachios, which is the highest fructose nut on the market. And like I said, 41,000 detoxes, it's like pattern recognition at this point. I can see what people are going through. The description of your question is we have a group of 4 things that are called borderline foods. Nobody is getting out of detox without having at least some of these or all of them. And it doesn't matter. That's okay. So it's grains, fruit and fruit juices and dried fruit, dairy, and nuts and nut butters. Okay. Now, as you heal, some of those things, or sometimes all of them, will start to treat you like sugar, and they will start to set up cravings. You'll eat full bags of pistachios. You'll binge on fruit. You'll whatever. And there's just a level of sensitivity. Most of my people are very sensitive, kind of Elaine Aronson's work, The Highly Sensitive Person. They're very sensitive. And as they heal from the powder, the sugars, the flours, too much orange juice is going to set off cravings for chocolate, It's, again, it's pattern recognition for me at this point. It's really repetitive now. People are people. They're the same all over, and their biochemistry is pretty close. And so some addicts, the people that are addicts, and the numbers break down like this: about a third of people are addicts, and about a third of people are harmful users. And just because of this food system, these folks, if they could do a reset, they lose the weight and they can use sugar a couple times a year or whatever. And then there's average normal people who, like your friend, who can have a half a glass of wine and nobody worries about it. And they can have a half a cookie and leave it there. And you're like, how did they do that? How did they have half a cookie and leave?
These fractions are the population as a whole.
As
a
a
third
whole.
are addicted, a third are
Yeah.
abusers, but not necessarily addicted.
Yeah. Those are the numbers. And they're pretty consistent in our group. And all of my contemporaries say pretty much the same thing. Yeah.
And
So I
do
want
you draw a distinction between sugar addiction and food addiction? And in other words, can someone have an addiction to some other component of food besides sugar? Or do you think they're really one and the same?
Certainly. I think food addiction at some level is a little bit of misnomer, but here's the one thing that I think we differ on in a lot of programs is that volume eating, where you eat way too much food, is one of the reasons treatment centers, 12 steps, and some other programs out there make you weigh and measure. They make you weigh your food and measure your food. And what volume eating is really just stretching your stomach receptor, your stretch receptors in your stomach, to get that hit of dopamine and endorphins and stuff. You get a little hit. But we found that about 85% of people who will get off the flour and sugar, they're not really volume addicts. They're not like food addicts, they're not like volume addicts. And so those folks, but the folks that are, that 15% is real, and they have to weigh and measure. They can't continue to eat. And honestly, in the beginning, I actually tell people they can overeat a little bit because it's, again, another little methadone or Suboxone to kind of ease you off of the other drugs. And most people don't, that doesn't translate into a volume eater or a food addict, Again, I think food addiction, I think as it's described today and at the Food Addiction Institute, food addiction is primarily flour and sugar addiction, but most of them, even pretty much all of the educators there, I would say 95% of them weigh and measure, which I'm just not a fan of. And I've seen it up close and personal. 85% of people, that just dissipates. It goes away. The volume eating goes away.
It's quite possible that I've heard this 1,000 times before, but somehow you've managed to reframe it in a way that it hits me differently.
Thanks.
I've probably heard people talk about sugar addiction 1,000 times,
Right.
and I never put that in the same, literally the same category as alcoholism. The only actual addicts I think I've ever known have been alcoholics.
Yeah.
And
They're not alone in that, by the way.
I've watched good friends
Sure.
with alcoholism, and it's a special kind of hell. And I don't disbelieve you. I'm just kind of working through my thoughts here. It's hard to think about sugar addiction being the same basic process
Yeah.
as alcoholism, but you make a really good case.
I appreciate that. And I understand you're not alone in this. I get this all the time. So you're not unusual in any way, shape, or form. And I do believe it is the golden key to the golden lock to the obesity crisis, the metabolic health crisis, the diabetes crisis, pandemics, if you will, is that very few people, even people who profess to understand it, even people who sell products that I don't believe they understand that at its depth, because they've never dealt with the severity of addicts that I've dealt with,
Yeah.
and got, put type 2 in remission, lost 100 pounds. And, I understand your reticence. I understand um, and I love seeing that light bulb go on, just so you know. I really do. I did my job, I guess.
So I was just talking about this with some friends a couple of days ago, that uh, I personally have never dealt with the type of addictive behavior that you talk about. And I personally think that's strictly, I just, I'm just wired that way. I think I probably fall in that third, that it's just not a big deal one way or another. So I don't understand it from the inside.
Yeah.
But I read the Alcoholics Anonymous big book years ago, and I was just struck by the profound stories there. And again, I'm not speaking from experience, so I want to hear your feedback on this.
Yeah.
The starting point for recovering from alcoholism is admitting that you're powerless over alcohol.
Right.
And that seems to be where it starts. Is it the same thing with,
I'm not a big fan of powerlessness.
okay,
I mean, I did get sober in AA 40 years ago, a couple days ago back here. 40 years ago, I walked into an AA, or also NA meeting at the time, and it was very helpful. But I don't believe the 12 steps have evolved, mainly because the 12 steps have a tenet that says no outside information. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. There's no science or whatever. It's basically a spiritual, people
right,
spiritual, but it's a religious program. And I lean very heavily on the science. Dr. O has been on my summit before. I've interviewed 400 of the world's leading experts. I'm, you know, I have cobbled together this with, the experience of a decade of helping sugar addicts get off of, or more than that, but get off of sugar. And kind of, this is where this information has come. It's really been the intersection of my own addiction recovery
right,
and food stuff, and working with, I mean, I started in late stage food addiction, right? That's where the people that I dealt with the most. These are folks who, you know, 400 pounds overweight, losing limbs, going blind, and they still can't quit sugar. You're going to die this year if you don't get off the sugar. And then the people who have succeeded, who have those same maladies, who go abstinent and work through all these emotional issues of why they used it to begin with. And it's always much deeper than you wanted a candy bar, a lot deeper than that. And, personally, I'm getting stronger on this, but I think it's criminal to give children sugar before they're 5. I think it should be illegal. 50 years from now, they're going to say that, you used to give sugar because we'll have the diagnostic tools.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
nobody would argue with it's criminal to give liquor to a 4-year-old.
Correct.
That's self-evident.
Right.
So I can see that.
I mean, it's
What
really, the science explodes every year. Every year there's new findings and what, backing up. I don't want to call it, mine's not a thesis anymore because I have in excess of 1,000 written testimonials that would tell you that this is what's happened to them, this process. And these are people like my client is a woman between 55 and 90. These are not people that have not tried everything before. They've already tried
Yeah.
everything once before. Yeah.
and what's success to you on this, right? I mean, is this, alcoholism where you need to remain abstinent for the rest of your life? Or, can people get to a point where they can, have some sugar and or, have some, let's say, sugar related substances, they can go back to eating, let's say, flour, grain, or something like that, maybe not having, again, the obvious and the processed sugar, but they can have some things that are going to turn into sugar in their body. What does
No,
success look like
I love this
ultimately?
question. Look, so, as I was coming up, I was a hardcore abstinence based. When I was coming through recovery, if you were using methadone or you were using antidepressants, you were not clean, right? So I was a hardcore abstinence-based guy. But as Suboxone came on the field, I wasn't a fan of methadone, but as Suboxone came on the field, I started to see people that lived instead of died, as we get a fentanyl thing. And so I became a fan not only of not anonymity, but of a harm reduction, which is a drug and alcohol term. And I believe the same in sugar. Any reduction is good. And my only job in life is to get somebody to see and feel viscerally 90 days of 100% abstinence. Because it's not my job to tell someone they're an addict. It's their job to ascertain that. And the only way they can do it is to do a reset. I mean, there's 1,000 reset, whatever, cleanses, all this other stuff on the market, but they still don't do, abstinence, sugar, flour, and caffeine. They don't do it. But when they do it, I don't know. I don't think there's anybody. Now, they might slip or whatever, but almost everyone wants to stay that way. They want to stay abstinent, right? Because they know if they have that stuff on a Friday night, the next day they go through a cycle. That night, they're sweating when they sleep. They don't sleep well. And then the next morning, they're starving and they're craving sugar and they're depressed, almost exactly the same process if they truly healed for 90 days, right? And so they say to themselves, life's too short. I can't believe that I used to live that way. And then they make their own decision around it. I don't make it for them. And rightfully, I shouldn't. It's not my job. My job is to help them if they have a desire. And look, 85% of people come to me for weight loss. And so I had to almost trick them into that this is what they need to do because they all, right up front, what they want is a food plan and an exercise plan.
Yeah.
This is the brainwashing of the $78 billion diet industry. They've brainwashed people to believe that if they eat this and if they, do that exercise wise, that they'll quote unquote lose weight or whatever. But it's not true for a third of the population and more maybe, but so yeah, no, I'm a harm reductionist, and if you can cut back and that works for you, great. But anybody that really wants, my thing is about self-actualization, these are not the weight. I'm going to tell you a true statistic. So I've had many people lose 100 pounds and many more put type 2 in remission. And rheumatoid arthritis is a paper tiger. 95 or 98% of people, their hands and knees stop hurting like in less than 30 days. Okay. And they can't believe it. Like they thought they were getting old. But when I do surveys of that group, of the group of success stories, the number one thing that they are excited about is that their brain came back online, that they focus better, they remember better, their anxiety is lessened. You know what I mean? It's not, and to me, to watch people, not necessarily, their face gets thin and they lose weight on the Zoom, but they start to do things. They go dancing and it's a self-actualization transformation process. This is what this is really about in my books. And you will lose some weight, just so you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I mean it's interesting, and again we see this type of thing in our audience and my practice. People once they can get through that sort of detox period, right? They do see how good they can feel, and the brain fog clears up, and they're like you said, the joint pain and everything else is getting better. But they want that. Most people want that, and that helps to reinforce this ultimately. What would you say to someone? We probably have many people in the audience that are listening to this, and they went on their low carb carnivore approach, right, and it helped them lose the weight or cure their autoimmune disorder or whatever it might be. And they've done great with it, but they didn't really think about it as an addiction, per se. And maybe they haven't done that, kind of work from that perspective. I mean, do you think that's okay? Is that sort of what you were talking about, the sort of 1/3 maybe, that it's just harmful use situation and it's not necessarily an addiction situation?
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that'd be great for folks. And it's a solid number. I mean, some people say, oh, I didn't have this, I didn't have that, Mike. And I'm so great, but they lost a few pounds and the brain's clearing up and whatever, their carpal tunnel's gone and they're happy, So that's great for them. And it's the folks that are the name of my book is The Last Resort Sugar Tea. I'm the last house on the block. These people have tried everything else, cabbage soup diet, everything you can think of. And I think what happens, like by the time you get to be a 50 or 55-year-old woman, just the society, you have dieted so much, you've tried everything, and you've narrowed it down to sugar. Like your Achilles heel is sugar. Like you've been able to do everything that anyone's ever told you. And I think one of the other issues is a lot of docs and a lot of therapists and a lot of gym owners and a lot of diet folks who preach this stuff were never addicts. So they can't really relate to the struggle, get down and give me 20 push-ups. They say, you're not doing your workout or you're not doing the, but they don't realize that this is a little deeper for them, for their other, and look, they've already got a good practice and a third of the people are paying attention to them, or two-thirds of people are paying attention to them. And so they're doing okay in their practice or they're at their gym or whatever. But then the other third kind of slip away and they don't know what happened to them. And those are the folks we concentrate on.
Gotcha. Now you mentioned a couple of times, your sort of average or avatar is a woman. Is this more of a problem for women than in men, or do you think it does affect both sexes equally?
It does affect both sexes, but I think genuinely, and this is not sexist, and this, a lot of my folks would back me up on this, is that it's a good girl's drug. I mean, women use sugar and men drink, and that's the way it is. That was the way it was in my family, and that's just the way it is. I mean, I think that's changing, obviously, but those folks that are of that age, that's the world they grew up in. And and this is pretty straightforward, is that they are people pleasers. They have grown up in a world that they help their kids and their teachers and their employers and their husband and their boss, and they neglected themselves. And this program is a sticking up for yourself program, a codependency recovery program, a saying no program, a setting boundaries program. You know what I mean? It truly models so much closer to an addiction recovery program than a diet program or a weight loss program. And women are the ones who have carried that burden, and then they get shamed a lot for their bodies. They have, and they've tried the dieting. It hasn't worked for them.
This is a really interesting reframe. It triggers a thought. I'd love to hear your comments. And I realize it may be well outside your area of specialty, or it might be right smack in the sweet spot. Social media has been demonstrated to trigger a dopamine response.
Yeah.
And most of the apps on our smartphones have some sort of psychological engineering involved in them to keep us picking the phone up and looking at the app. My understanding is that is, for all intents and purposes, at least at the neurochemical level, addictive behavior. Are we talking
Absolutely.
about the same thing?
We are absolutely. I recently purchased phoneaddiction.com and you will see that site up soon. You're 100% right. There's no if, ands, or buts in my mind. Should be criminal to give a phone or a device of any kind to a child under 5 years old. You're rewiring their brain wrong and badly. I agree.
What
Yeah.
is five an arbitrary number?
Five, I think, is there's no outside of the home stuff going on. That's the reason I give it.
Okay.
I'd like to see it longer,
Yeah.
obviously, but
My guess is pre-adolescence.
yeah,
That
yeah,
would be, we know the adolescent brain is that highly malleable organ. And once you get through adolescence, that's pretty much a lot of things are set directionally. My
yeah.
guess is anything done before adolescence or before puberty kicks in, we really need to be protecting those brains.
I
Okay.
mean, the movement to this is one of the things that spurred me is the movement to have phone-free schools is exploding, both here and in Great Britain and Australia. That's getting really big, and it's going to happen. It should happen.
I struggle to understand why it's ever been okay. Anybody who's
Well,
ever been a child or B had a child knows that's just a bad idea.
there was a company in Los Angeles. They had to change their name. It was so egregious, called Dopamine Labs. And Dopamine Labs works with Facebook and, to make apps sticky. And they work with slot machine companies too.
Yeah.
They just study this stuff to keep you on it, to keep you on the platform.
Yeah.
And it is truly rewiring your brain. Like it's wiring it in a way that definitely not good for kids in the early days, for sure.
Oh, there was a question I had that came up right early as we were talking that I want to make sure I address because my suspicion is we've got a lot of listeners asking the same question. You're saying sugar and you specified fructose. What about the non-sugar sweeteners? Oh, I don't drink Coke. I drink Diet Coke.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, this is Lewis Cantley, the Cantley lab at Cornell. They named it after him, but he just moved over to Harvard. So he's about 70 something years old, but I don't think they've named a lab for him yet. But, it's like the thing we're fighting against is the sweetness, the sweet taste. Okay. It's the sweet taste that lights up the desire for sugar. And when you have that, your body's saying, where are the calories? Where's the real stuff? And it keeps that, you'll hear me say this a lot. It keeps the cravings alive. And that's, besides the fact it's a freaking chemical experiment, most of that stuff. I'm
Right.
a little disheartened. Some of my heroes, which will go unnamed, but I have named them before. So they're starting to study allulose because it has some kind of GLP-1 like reaction or something. And it's not the allulose or the GLP, it's the sweet taste on the tongue that is keeping the cravings for sugar alive. And
Yeah.
look, who in God's name wants to do this if you're craving? It's the second thing I study the most of is craving. You want peace with this. You don't want to forget about it, to not think about it, to not have it rent-free re-rent in your head. That's the main thing. The main thing is to be at peace with it. And honestly, sweeteners of all stripes and kinds will keep that alive if you use
Yeah,
it.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Phil, with the folks, I mean, your own personal experience, but also all the folks you work with, that number of a third being literally addicted, a third being abusers, and a third just,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't recognized quite to that level the truly addictive behavior, and this may
yeah,
just be the selection bias of my practice and also just a little bit about, how exactly you define that. As I think even for someone like myself who, I mean, I was able to cut it out and, and now I guess I'm in that sort of take it or leave it, and I can moderate it, on the rare occasions that I have it anymore. Although, as I look back at some of my past habits, I mean, some of them would certainly line up with addictive behavior. It's a question of, maybe when we're thinking about that third that, are addicted, that have this addiction, are some able to overcome it without maybe coming at it with the traditional addictive approach? That's my question. But I certainly can think of, I would say it's maybe not quite a third. I would put it more at like 20% in my practice. And again, maybe that's just a selection bias of the people who, like, we're going around and they're like, yeah, I know. And then, they're like, we're going to do it. And I'm like, okay, let's get 30 days under our belt. And then, they're calling me at 20 days and they're like, I kind of binged again, and those are the people that, I truly put in that addictive category. But again, I admit I don't recognize it. There are probably others that have been able to sort of work through it without, necessarily, again, I'm oftentimes talking to them about their heart disease. We're not going into the childhood experiences around this.
That's a good clarification. And, what is it? 30, could be 30%, could be 27. I don't think there's an exact number, but
yeah,
it's pretty close.
Yeah, no, but it's a fascinating topic that I've certainly, thought more about, and it's been great. This has been a great conversation. We've had previous conversations with Bidden Johnson,
Yeah.
And
Bidden is the one that came up with the third and the third,
yeah.
that.
And, and there does seem to be more, more awareness of this, I would say, within the metabolic health community. And I do think it's a very real issue. It's just so interesting to think about this substance that's kind of ubiquitous in the world, in society, and it's definitely causing problems. I think the more we talk about it, the more success we're ultimately going to have.
I want to reiterate or clarify. You say if somebody they can get that 30 days under their belts where they really are free of it, that's when you really start to see a significant, you have a new point of view. Your perspective changes.
Yeah. Closer to 90 for real, 60 or 90.
Oh, 90. Okay.
The 30 will get you, it'll keep the voice will come down. So there's no instant gratification. The physical cravings will have dissipated a lot. The cravings become kind of emotional because when you have sugar in, you're using it regularly, then you want more. So yeah, I call it healing. If you heal up, I'm working on a theory called internal cutting. You know what I mean? You think about it like you're dragging a razor. You're not dragging a razor across your arm, but you're realizing now with all the science that you are causing inflammation, joints and livers and everything. You're cutting yourself on the inside, and that's going to produce endorphins, let alone everything else we've talked about, and dopamine. And so, people need to realize that's not healthy.
Wow. I feel like we just opened a gigantic can of worms.
If I get you thinking, then we did good, huh?
It's really good because our focus has always been on the physical side, the neurochemical side, a little bit of the psychological and emotional, but really our focus has been on the physical side. And we've even talked to Bitten Johnson. But the idea that there's folks out there that are trying their best, they're trying their hardest, and just keep failing.
That's it.
It's the same problem. It's the same reason an alcoholic keeps going back and grabbing the booze under the kitchen sink that he's got hidden.
And you look at it from the outside.
If you think of it that way, it really changes the approach.
I mean, you as likely a non-addict, you look at that and you're going, what the hell? The guy says, I'm only drinking on the weekends. And then you see the 200 or 300, 400 pound overweight person and you're like, what are you doing to yourself? And you can't,
Yeah, exactly. That's
a non-addict to kind of see it and to viscerally feel it so that you can hang long enough to help them out.
yeah.
Uh, and it's like any, and this is kind of the sad part of the alcohol and drug stuff too, is if you got cancer, you're not going to give them tough love and let them hit their bottom. It's like, that's not the same. You know, it's a hard process, and the people that attempt it are very courageous because there's a lot to it if they really want to get well.
There's going to be people listening who are going to say, this may be me, or this may be someone I know and love. What's next steps? What do you recommend next?
Yeah, no, it's like we said, you have to detox. You have to look at you have to make it for a certain, there is a little muscling to that, but one of the things that's been the most effective is support meetings. Just like I tell people, I built my company backwards because I knew the only way to do this was to have connections and, people that were doing it. And that's, you end up not talking about sugar or diet or exercise or anything. You talk about what's been eating you. Came from the emotional eating folks, but it's real. What's been bothering you, and you don't have to go and be alone and self-soothe. One of the symptoms of addiction is isolation and not connection. It's the opposite of connection. So you need connection. And when you're having a connection, it's the connection of someone who's already been there or is right there with you, and other people have been there. That's the magic. And now there's very science-based, peer-reviewed stuff that groups support like that. Even if it's like cancer, you join a cancer survivor group, your chances to survive over the long term go way through the roof. And it's the only thing that's really ever worked in drugs and alcohol. Yeah, I think you have to join some type of support group, and there's plenty of them. Mine, the Bittens, everybody's got one.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you for the amazing work you're doing. For anyone that wants to check out your group, addiction.com is the website. And then, as we said, you're the sugar-free man on social media. Yeah, thank you for all the awareness you're bringing to this and all of the amazing work that you're, doing to help people that are suffering from this.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. You guys, it's good to talk, get the hard questions. I like the hard.
Okay, I've got one last really hard question.
Okay.
So when you were flying the lunar module around the moon and you knew that Buzz and Neil were down there on the surface, what did it feel like?
They landed on the moon on my birthday in the July.
For
And
those of you not old enough to get my joke.
and Michael was supposed to be stepping on the moon, but he got bumped back to the module of lunar. So yeah. And it's even worse when the movie Liam Neeson was out, the Irish Revolutionary War hero, Michael Collins.
Oh, that's right. That's true.
And
I
I
completely
really
forgot about that one.
I
What was
really
it like leading the Irish in their march for
I really screwed up because the guy who ended up buying michaelcollins.com, which forwarded to Warner Brothers for 20 years, is a realtor in Los Angeles. I missed on that one. So we're not John Smith, but there's a few of us.
Our guest has been Michael Collins. He's Dr. Philip Ovadia. I'm Jack Heald. Thanks for joining us. The contact information for Mike Collins will be on the show notes, sugaraddiction.com. And we will talk to you all next time.
You guys are the best. Thank you so much.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.